November 12, 1945, 05:30 a.m. Prisoner of War Camp 44, outskirts of Hamburg. The dawn did not break, it simply bled through the fog in shades of bruised gray. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine needles and the stagnant mud that coated everything in the camp. For the 60 German women sleeping in Barrack 4, the morning bugle was usually the signal for another day of tedious laundry duty or potato peeling. But today, the bugle didn't sound. Instead, the heavy wooden door was kicked open with a violence that rattled the window frames. Cold wind rushed in, carrying the freezing drizzle of a northern German autumn. "Raus, everybody up! Outside now!" The voice belonged to Sergeant Miller, a man known for his short temper and strict adherence to the schedule. But today, his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before, a tightness. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood 4 other soldiers, armed not with the usual batons, but with Lee Enfield rifles slung across their chests. Their faces were unreadable, shadowed by their helmets. Hildegard Voss, a former nurse who had served on the Eastern Front, sat up slowly. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Armed guards at dawn never meant work duty. Armed guards meant special orders. The women stumbled out into the yard. They lined up in the mud, shivering in their thin gray tunics. The cold bit into their skin, but the fear bit deeper. Usually, the assignment officer would read names from a clipboard. Today, there was no clipboard. Instead, there was a pile of metal tools thrown onto the wet ground near the gate. The sound of metal clashing against stone echoed in the silence. Hildegard squinted through the mist. They weren't brooms. They weren't potato peelers. They were shovels, heavy military-grade entrenching spades with long wooden handles. "Pick them up," Miller commanded. He gestured to the first 12 women in the line. Hildegard was among them. So was Alara, a young girl of 19 who had lied about her age to join the Auxiliaries. Alara looked at the shovel at her feet as if it were a viper. She looked at Hildegard, her eyes wide with a question she was too terrified to whisper. Why shovels? Why now? Hildegard picked up the tool. The wood was damp and cold. It felt heavy in her hands. Heavier than a wounded soldier. Heavier than a stretcher. She knew what shovels were used for in the woods at dawn. She had seen the pits in Poland. March to the North Gate. The order confirmed their worst nightmares. The North Gate didn't lead to the farms or the laundry facilities. The North Gate opened directly into the Teutoburg Forest, a dense, ancient woodland where the trees grew close together and the shadows lingered all day. As they marched, the mud sucking at their boots, a whisper traveled down the line. "It's a reprisal," someone murmured, "for the bombing in London, or the camps they found in the east. They are finally going to do it." Hildegard gripped her shovel tighter. She didn't speak. She was calculating the distance to the tree line, wondering if she could run. But the soldiers flanked them closely, fingers resting on triggers. The forest swallowed them. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the camp, the engines, the voices, faded away, replaced by the dripping of water from branches and the crunch of boots on dead leaves. They walked for 20 minutes. It felt like 20 years. Finally, in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines that blocked out the gray sky, Sergeant Miller raised his hand. "Halt." The women stopped. They stood in a ragged circle, breathing hard, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The ground here was soft, undisturbed earth, perfect for digging. "Here," Miller said. He pointed to the center of the clearing. He took a tape measure from his pocket and marked out a rectangular area on the ground. It was long, it was wide. 6 feet deep, he barked, "and keep the edges straight." Ilara let out a small, strangled sob. 6 feet deep. It was the universal dimension. Not a latrine, not a foxhole, a grave. Hildegard looked at the sergeant. His face was stone. He wasn't looking at them with hatred, which was almost worse. He was looking at them with the detached efficiency of an undertaker. "Well," he shouted, "the ground won't open itself. Dig." 2 hours passed. The hole was now waist deep. The rhythm of the work had become a hypnotic, terrifying cadence. Thud, scoop, throw. The women were covered in mud, their faces streaked with sweat and earth. Hildegard's hands were blistered and bleeding, the raw skin sticking to the wooden handle. But she didn't stop. Stopping meant drawing attention. Attention meant death. Down in the pit, the world had shrunk to walls of wet clay, and the gray sky above. From this angle, the British guards standing on the edge looked like giants, silhouetted against the light, their rifles pointing down into the grave. It was a position of ultimate vulnerability. They had dug their own trap. Suddenly, Elara dropped her shovel. The clang of metal was sharp. The young girl sank to her knees in the mud, sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't," she wailed, her voice echoing in the pit. "Please, just shoot me now. I don't want to lie in the dirt. Please." A guard stepped forward to the edge. Hildegard moved instinctively, placing her body between the girl and the rifle. She pulled Elara up, gripping her tunic with muddy fingers. "Stand up," she hissed. "Do not give them the satisfaction. If we die standing." But Hildegard's own legs were shaking. The hole was big enough for all of them now. The work was done. Then came the sound they had been dreading. Engines. Heavy, grinding gears approaching through the forest track. It wasn't a jeep this time. It was a lorry, a big 3-ton Bedford. The sound grew louder, drowning out the wind. The women in the pit huddled together, clutching each other's arms, closing their eyes. This was it, the transport for the firing squad. Or perhaps the truck to carry away their belongings once they were covered over. The vehicle halted at the edge of the clearing. The engine cut. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with violence. Doors slammed. Heavy boots hit the ground. "All right, get them out," Miller ordered guards about the women. He was talking to the men in the truck. The guards at the edge of the pit lowered their rifles, not to fire but to sling them over their shoulders. They reached down, extending hands to the prisoners. "Out you come," one soldier said, his voice surprisingly devoid of malice. "Work's finished." Confused, terrified, the women scrambled out of the grave, their boots sliding on the wet clay. They were herded to the side, lined up against the trees. They waited for the order to turn around. They waited for the click of the bolts. Instead, they saw the back of the truck open. 4 British soldiers stood by the tailgate. They weren't holding machine guns. They were sliding something heavy out onto the forest floor. It was a long wooden box. Then another, and another. Coffins, rough-hewn pine, simple but sturdy. Hildegard stopped breathing. She counted them. 6 coffins. There were 60 women. The math didn't add up. These weren't for them. As the soldiers carried the first coffin past the line of trembling women, Hildegard saw it. Draped over the rough wood was not the Union Jack. It was a flag she hadn't seen treated with respect in months. A German flag. Not the swastika that was banned, but the old imperial colors, or perhaps just a simple Wehrmacht standard. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, removing his helmet. He looked at the women, his face weary. 6 of your men died in the infirmary last night, he said, his German clumsy but clear. Wounds from the Eastern Front. Gangrene. We couldn't save them. He gestured to the open grave the women had just dug. But we aren't going to throw them in a ditch like dogs. A soldier deserves a soldier's burial, even if he fought on the wrong side. The realization hit Hildegard like a physical blow. They hadn't been digging their own graves. They had been digging a resting place for their brothers. The British weren't executing them. They were honoring their dead. A British padre stepped out from the passenger seat. He wore a stole over his combat uniform, the purple fabric stark against the khaki. He carried a small, worn prayer book. Sergeant Miller signaled to his men. Present, arms. The command was sharp. The British soldiers snapped their rifles to their shoulders in a salute. Not for a king, not for a general, but for 6 enemy privates in wooden boxes. The women watched in stunned silence as the coffins were lowered into the earth they had dug. There was no hatred in the movements of the British pallbearers, just the quiet, heavy respect of men who know that death wears no uniform. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The padre spoke in English first, his voice carrying through the mist. Then he looked up at the women huddled by the trees. He switched to German. Vater unser im Himmel, our Father in heaven. It started as a whisper. One of the women, Elara, began to mouth the words along with him. Then another joined. Then Hildegard. Soon the clearing was filled with the sound of 60 women and 12 British soldiers reciting the same prayer. The sound rose through the pine trees, mixing with the smell of wet earth. For 2 minutes, the war did not exist. There were no victors, no vanquished, only the living burying the dead. Miller handed Hildegard a shovel, but this time, the gesture was different. It wasn't an order to work. It was an invitation to participate. "It is your custom," he said quietly, "to throw the first dirt." Hildegard took the shovel. Her hands were still bleeding, but she didn't feel the pain. She scooped up a small amount of dark forest soil. She walked to the edge of the pit and let it fall onto the wood. Thud. The sound was final. She looked at Miller. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. In that look, Hildegard realized something that terrified her more than the execution would have. The enemy was human. And if the enemy was human, then the hate she had been fed for years was a lie. They walked back in silence. The march back to camp was not forced. The guards walked alongside the women, not hurting them. The fear of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a strange, heavy confusion. Ilara walked beside Hildegard, wiping mud from her face. "I thought," she started, then stopped. "I know," Hildegard replied. "We all did." They had gone into the forest expecting to die. They returned having witnessed an act of grace. The shovels they carried were no longer symbols of their own doom, but tools of a shared duty. They were dirty, cold, and prisoners. But for the first time in a long time, they felt dignity. History remembers the battles. It remembers the generals and the treaties. But it often forgets the quiet mornings in a muddy forest where enemies decided to be men and women first and soldiers second. The graves are still there, somewhere in the Teutoburg Forest, unmarked now by time. But the memory of that day lived on in Hildegard, in Ilara, and in the 60 women who learned that strength is not showing how many people you can kill. Restraint is the ultimate power. If it reminded you that humanity can exist even in the darkest trenches, hit that subscribe button. We are dedicated to uncovering the stories the textbooks left out, the stories of honor, mercy, and the thin line between vengeance and justice. Share this video to keep history alive. Thank you for watching.